Chapter 23 and 24 are dealing with the goods and services market through the aggregate expenditure model, which is going to be our first primary model we're going to discuss in terms of the macroeconomy. This model actually today is, I guess, somewhat controversial. Some macro courses choose not to teach it, others do. I am a fan of this model and do like the material that comes out of it and like to cover it. Not there aren't some deficiencies in this model, but I think the benefits outweigh any potential problems within it. Okay. Again, so we're talking about aggregate measures of the economy, and I think in this discussion I'm going to blend both chapters 23 and 24 together. Chapter 23 primarily discussing aggregate expenditures and aggregate output, forming the base of the model, and then an extension of that model into chapter 24 when we discuss the role of government and fiscal policy. Okay. Again, just some basic definitions, what we mean by aggregate output and income. Within the model, these are going to be equivalent to one another, but output specifically is talking about the total quantity of goods and services produced in an economy during a specific time period, where aggregate income is going to focus on total income received by all factors of production during a given time period. In the larger macroeconomy, these are going to have to be set equal to one another, where aggregate output is in fact going to equal aggregate income. Later on in the course we'll stress the term aggregate demand when we get into the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. That also is going to be equivalent to what we're calling aggregate income, aggregate output, aggregate demand. Later on, or we've already made mention of real gross domestic product. Same thing. We're just using different terminology to refer to basically the same statistical concept. This aggregate expenditure model was really formed by Keynes in his General Theory, 1936. So this is, again, a core of macroeconomic theory, primarily developed by Keynes to help us have a fundamental understanding or modeling of the macroeconomy. Again, start off with a couple simple notions related to income and expenditures. We know income is going to be equal to consumption plus savings, very simplistic. We can also extend that as we go through and talk about and separate out personal income and net income, sometimes gross or net income. Personal or gross income can be consumption plus savings plus taxes. What we're going to call as net income or disposable income is the term that's most commonly used, is going to be essentially after-tax income, simply consumption plus savings. In terms of expenditures, we're going to refer to expenditures as consumption plus investment. So we have two things there basically in terms of income, disposable income, consumption plus savings, expenditures, consumption plus investment. Which once we set those together in the aggregate, then we get a very elegant equation. Consumption plus savings equals consumption plus investment, which means then in macro equilibrium, in this closed system economy, investment must equal savings. So we're going to have that general definition as we go forward. Once we get into government and into the foreign sector, then we can add on to this model. But we're going to have that basic setup, investment equals savings in a macro equilibrium. The first, suppose, major discussion they walk us through is this idea of the consumption function. So the consumption function is going to be important for us. And the notions of the consumption function. Again, these two chapters can at times be challenging. We do have some algebraic expressions to deal with. and some minimal algebra to deal with in some of the problems. But what we're thinking about, and this goes back to Keynes and his general theory, what's the relationship between income and consumption? And one of our most stable theoretical models in the last 80 years has been the relationship between income and consumption. We know as income increases, consumers increase their consumption. By definition, if income equals consumption plus savings, we also know as income goes up, consumers also increase their saving. The question then is, what is the proportion of consumption and saving in regards to the change in income? In total, we know those proportions are going to have to equal 1. The total change in consumption, some percentage between 0 and 1. The total change in savings, between some percentage of 0 and 1, as reflected by change in income, must sum up to 1, or that total change in income. So the consumption function is simply going to be, as illustrated on page 454, it's just going to be a line that's going to represent, or it could be represented as a curve, but oftentimes we see it as a line. It represents this relationship between consumption and income based on that percentage of change of consumption due to the percentage change of income. So for example, if the change in consumption as a result of the change in income was 80%, so out of every dollar we increase income, if we increase consumption then by increase income by $1 and we increase consumption by 80 cents, that's an 80% change. The slope then for the consumption function would be 0.8. So the consumption function is just going to be a line that's going to represent the relationship between consumption and income, and it's represented by a very easy equation there on 455. C, or consumption, equals A plus BY. A in the equation represents the y-intercept, or in our terminology in macroeconomics, A is going to represent autonomous consumption. What's the amount of consumption consumers would undertake when income falls to 0? BY represents, B is going to represent the slope of the consumption function, which is going to be what we're going to call, as we go through here, the marginal propensity to consume. And then Y, of course, is going to be our income. So as Y changes, B is going to be the proportion of consumption plus A, autonomous consumption, equals C, consumption. And they spell it out for you there in the chapter. I'm not sure if they explicitly walk us through, yeah they do, over on 457, a companion savings function. If income, I, and be wary, we often refer to investment as I as well, but if income, that I often refer to aggregate income and aggregate expenditures as Y, just to denote that it's also output, but then may put YE for aggregate expenditure or YI for aggregate income. So if income, YI, aggregate income equals consumption plus savings, and then we can get a consumption function out of that relationship, we must necessarily also be able to get out of that relationship a savings function. So in 457, they show us a savings function that takes the form S savings equals negative A plus 1 minus BY. That equation then represents the savings function, whereas negative A represents savings when income is 0. If A represents autonomous consumption, or the spending that occurs when income is 0, then negative A must represent our dis-savings when income is 0. 1 minus B is simply going to be the total income change minus the change in consumption, which was represented by the letter B, which is going to give us 1 minus B, which is the proportion change in savings as a result of the change in income. we have two key equations there. C equals A plus BY for the consumption function, and S equals negative A plus 1 minus BY, which equals the savings function. They also show us on a couple places there that we know that the slope of the consumption function is equivalent to what we're going to call the marginal propensity to consume. It's known as the change in B divided by the change in Y. Similarly, the savings function, slope, is going to be the change in savings over the change in income Y. Also equivalent to what we're going to call the marginal propensity to save. So you got two separate things. Marginal propensity to consume, which is the slope of the consumption function, change in C over change in Y. Y here is income. And then the marginal propensity to save, which is the slope of the savings function. We're also calling it, I'm calling it 1 minus B, since B is the slope of the consumption function, and it's going to be the change in S, savings, over the change in Y, income as well. Now in total, then what that's going to mean to us is that if the total change in consumption and the total change in saving must equal the total change in income, then our marginal propensities to consume of consumption and saving must sum up to 1. On the bottom of 455, they show us that the MPC, marginal propensity to consume, plus MPS, marginal propensity to save, does in fact have to be equal to 1. Okay. Now again, it's very important that you do take the time and read through this chapter. This material can be a little difficult at times. That's for sure. Okay, in terms though, let's step back a second. In terms of our consumption function, there are some ways that consumption function can actually shift. We know if income changes that we're simply going to be moving along the consumption function as reflected by the slope of the consumption function corresponding to a change in consumption. But a couple reasons can actually shift the consumption function. One is a change in wealth, which would shift the consumption function upward. One is a change in interest rates. There's a negative relationship there, so lower interest rates would also shift it upward. Change in the price level, which would also shift consumption function upward. And general expectations, psychology, the way we feel about the world around us. If we feel good about the future, that also then can shift the consumption function upward. So there are some key ways the consumption function can in fact shift. Okay. We mentioned the expenditure equation before and then a moment ago as Y, which Y equal expenditures equals C plus I, where I there is investment. Expenditures equals consumption plus investment. If that's where we start with this model, and then you introduce into it a consumption function, A plus BY, what you can do there is we can actually solve for equilibrium income in a whole variety of possible equations or settings. So if we initially assume that, let's say, investment is 0, but we have some consumption function given to us, and I'm just going to use some problems that I've worked out on my own. So initially we know that Y, expenditure, equals C plus I. And then if we have a given consumption function with some values, let's just say it's consumption C equals 100 plus 0.75 Y. So there's our consumption function, 100 plus 0.75 Y. The 0.75 would tell us that the slope of the consumption function is 0.75, meaning that for every dollar increase in income, we're going to increase consumption by 75 cents. And then investment's 0. If that's the case, then we can plug into our initial equation, Y plus CI, C, 100 plus 0.75Y, plug in investment I, which we're assuming initially 0. That gives us an equation then that says Y, in terms of expenditures or output, equals 100 plus 0.75Y plus 0. We can solve for Y for that equation, and if you solve through that, it turns out Y is equal to 400. Now what we've shown there is we've been able to deduce algebraically, some very basic algebra, equilibrium income in a hypothetical economy when a consumption function is given and the level of investment is given. In this case, the level of investment was 0. So you should be able to see, you should be able to work out, just with some paper on your own, that Y equals 100 plus 0.75Y plus 0. That's just Y equals C plus I. You should be able to solve that out and be able to show that Y is 400. And what oftentimes, especially in class, I refer to as Y star, with the star representing equilibrium, expenditures, output, income, whatever you want to call it. So we get 400 for our solution. What this chapter is really wanting to show us, in addition to these skills surrounding solving some basic algebraic equations for equilibrium income, what now happens in a given problem if positive investment is added into the mix from the private sector. Okay, so what we found there initially in this problem was if investment was 0 with a given consumption function of 100 plus 0.75Y, we get equilibrium income output 400. What happens now if we interject into this economy, say 25, and it doesn't matter what our amounts are, billions, whatever we want to talk about. But if we interject an investment of, let's say, 25 into this mix, what happens? How does that change equilibrium income, which currently is at 400? So you go back to your equation, Y equals C plus I. C is given, not changed, 100 plus 0.75Y. Remember, 0.75 is the marginal propensity to consume, or what we're calling V in the equation of the consumption function. Add into that now an investment of 25. So now at the end of that equation, C plus I, we have 100 plus 0.75Y plus 25. If you rework that out and solve for Y, now what we get, due to an investment of 25 into this economy, we're going to get equilibrium income equal to 500. Now, right there is the crux of this chapter, is the unique and interesting point surrounding this chapter. How did an infusion of investment of 25, if you want to call it billion, 25 billion, cause $100 billion increase in equilibrium output and income? Because when we go from 0 to 25 billion in investment, we go from 400 to 500 billion in terms of aggregate income and output. What happened there? Well, that process, and again, in terms of investment, they show us an investment curve on 458. Investment is just autonomous. It's going to be represented by a horizontal line at the level of investment. But when we interject that into our equation, into our hypothetical economy, what takes over now is the multiplier effect. The multiplier effect is going to use our marginal propensity to consume and our marginal propensity to save, to some extent, to come up with the multiplier, and in this case, what we can call the investment multiplier, because it's investment that's changing from the private sector. The multiplier is going to be equivalent to, and I show this to you, 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. and they show us this on the bottom of page 465. So 1 divided by 1 minus marginal propensity to consume, which is also what we have identified by the letter B in our consumption function. For this problem, we've already identified the marginal propensity to consume. It was in our consumption function, 0.75. So what we have now is we have a multiplier for this problem. The multipliers will be different for every problem depending on what the marginal propensity to consume is, of 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75. Now remember, the denominator in that equation for the multiplier, 1 minus MPC, is also the MPS, the marginal propensity to save. Because MPC plus MPS is 1, then it stands to reason that 1 minus the MPC must be the MPS. So the multiplier is also equivalent to 1 divided by the MPS, which if you do 1 minus 0.75 on the denominator, we get 1 divided by 0.25, which is then 1 divided by 0.25 gives us a multiplier value of 4 for this problem. Now why that's important to us, why would we want to know that? Because now we can use the multiplier directly with the change in investment to determine what the overall change in aggregate output and income will be. We've already worked through this. We know it's 100. The $25 billion increase in investment caused $100 billion change. And why? So in equation terms, we can say that the change in I investment times the multiplier will give us the total change in aggregate output income, what we're calling Y. So we have a simple equation, 25 times 4 equals 100. And there's our $100 billion change. From the $25 billion infusion, we go from 400 billion to 500 billion. This is all very elegantly mapped out in chapter 23. They work through the consumption function, and then once they extend investment into the consumption function, it's referred to as the aggregate expenditure curve, AE, which we're just also substituting in the letter Y, but equals C plus I. Okay, again, there's only so much we can talk about in this format. This perhaps is one of the key drawbacks to the online course. In class, we spend a significant amount of time working many of these equations, working these out, getting this properly, the steps properly worked out. If you're simply having an issue with the mathematics, with the algebra, that's something sort of beyond where we are in this class. Hopefully, you're not having those troubles. If you're having a problem with the algebra, then you need to seek out some help. And I'll be glad to help you all that I can, but we really can't go back and reteach a basic algebra course. Those are tools hopefully you already have embedded in your academic skill set. The last main thing they focus on, which I think is one of the better economics and practice sections on page 466, is this discussion of paradox of thrift. Paradox of thrift is important because it works through and tells us that in terms of the consumption saving question, that if consumers begin to save more, maybe they're worried about the future, and they begin to save more, then that cuts back on consumption, which in turn then cuts back on income through this multiplier effect, and it feeds itself. Therefore, more saving today leads to less income tomorrow, which in turn leads to less saving tomorrow. So it's why it's called the paradox of thrift. For individuals, as individuals save, obviously they're going to be better off for the future. But as collective communities and societies collectively in the aggregate begin to save more, then what's going to happen is income output is going to fall in the future, and all savings levels are going to fall in the future. So the paradox comes from more saving today actually leads you to be able to save less tomorrow, because there's going to be this perpetual downward spiral motion of the economy slowing down. In some sense related to a deflationary spiral, if you want to think of it in those terms. The other thing they key on is the multiplier in the real world. Most of these models, just for simplicity, give us a model that is in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 or what have you. The real world multiplier is typically somewhere in the range of 1.5 to 2, depending on which economists are doing the estimating. More conservative economists are going to put the multiplier at a much lower value. Perhaps more progressive or liberal economists are going to assume the multiplier is going to be higher. I like to think of it in terms of what's the existing level of excess capacity in the economy at the time. If there's a lot of excess capacity and a lot of unemployment in the private sector, then clearly, from what I've read and looked at, the multiplier will then tend to be much larger. If the economy is near full employment and the private sector is doing very well and we're growing, and then the multiplier tends to be much, much smaller. I think it's really a question of where are we in the economy at the time that reflects the magnitude of the multiplier, more so than just saying the multiplier is always low or the multiplier is always high. I wouldn't agree with those arguments along those lines. If you want to look at a couple problems and just sort of test yourself, and if you do have questions about it, feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to get back with you or guide you through some of these. But on 469, number 6 and then number 7 are both good problems to work through. 6 is more traditional in terms of what we talked about. 7 changes things just a little because they add this variable of wealth in there, but it's the same concept. But 6 is one perhaps you should focus more on. Okay, in terms of government fiscal policy, chapter 24. This is really just a extension of chapter 23. It's now introducing into the model y equals c plus I. It's adding the government sector, and we add this component g. So now we have, if you want to think of it this way, in terms of the macroeconomy, y equals c plus I plus g. As our main equation, we've not yet introduced the foreign sector, net exports, which is x plus m. Now if you have that, since we're talking now about a government, we also then can logically introduce into the equation taxes. Because if we're going to have government spending, or by default now we're going to have government taxation. So if the expenditure equation is y equals c plus I plus g, the aggregate income equation, now let's go back to our concept of personal income, c plus s plus t for taxes. Now we can add taxes in terms of our personal or gross income. So now we have two things. We have consumption plus investment plus government spending as aggregate expenditures, consumption plus savings plus taxes as aggregate income. These also sometimes are referred to by a couple other terms. Investment in government spending is oftentimes referred to as injections. Savings and taxes are oftentimes referred to as leakages. So if you think of setting those equations together, or equivalent, equal to one another, just like before we had income equals savings. Well, now if you if you put those equal to one another and solve, then the C's again drop out, and we end up with injections, investment plus government spending, equaling leakages, savings plus taxes. So again, in macro equilibrium, investment plus government spending must equal savings plus taxes. Now that does not mean, in this case now, that savings must equal investment or that government spending must equal tax revenue. But in the aggregate, those two sides of the equation must balance out. And again, this is where we're getting into fiscal policy with government spending and taxation. Again, just a very general definition of fiscal policy is going to be the government's deliberate use. There's discretionary, non-discretionary fiscal policy. We're typically thinking here about the deliberate use or intervention of government spending or taxation as a way of influencing aggregate output and income, which hence then also is related, of course, to the labor market and jobs. So fiscal policy, government spending, targeted government spending and taxation, targeted at meeting some goal of creating growth and setting infrastructure in place for more jobs. Again, creating growth. It's not so much that it's the spending and the taxes that's going to create growth, but the spending and the taxes is going to ripple through society and allow the private sector to begin to create growth. We'll talk later on in the next several chapters about the second big government policy that seeks to influence economic growth and job creation, and that's going to be monetary policy. So really the government has two big steering wheels that it's attempting to drive this national economy with. One is fiscal policy, the other is going to be monetary policy. We're going to focus here on fiscal policy. Again, this very much has been in the news for the last several years with President Obama's stimulus package that was passed in February of 2009 to attempt to create or set the stage to create growth and create jobs in the national economy. It was in the ballpark of about $800 billion. What it consisted of, that $800 billion, was about a third of it was tax cuts, and about 2/3 of it was government spending on infrastructure and all different types of government programs and policies, to aid the private sector in helping the private sector grow and begin to create more jobs. Just as a side note, two very renowned economists, Mark Zandi and Alan Blinder. Alan Blinder is a Princeton economics professor and has done some work for the Federal Reserve in the past. And then Mark Zandi is an economist for Moody's.com, financial firm, forecasting firm. And they did a study recently that found that the stimulus, in conjunction with the Federal Reserve's monetary policy changes since the Great Recession financial crisis hit, actually has resulted in about 3 million jobs being created that otherwise would not be created, and about 2 to 3 points added on to GDP. Again, their forecast was that without those measures in place, we would be seeing unemployment not at 9.6%, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 15-16%. And then in the real economy, that's not underemployment, which underemployment is at 15-16%. They said the real unemployment would be about 15-16%. And in fact, the economy would still be shrinking, which we know that for the past year now the economy has in fact been growing, although in the second quarter growth did slow considerably to around 2%, slightly less than 2%. So again, there are different takes on what happened in terms of the stimulus, all the way from it didn't really work to set its goals. Well, I don't think anybody would claim that the goal was to put unemployment at 5% and create, 4 or 5% growth from now on. But on the other hand, it definitely at least kept our head above water and stabilized the economy. Although we know there's still lots of problems with it out there. So you really get two really contrasting views from economists. One side will say that the stimulus was a failure, it didn't work. The other side will say the stimulus worked as intended and as we expected, but perhaps the problem is that it was way too small, and that if it would have just been much larger, we would have witnessed much greater results. Unemployment would already be much lower, growth would be much faster, and then the private sector would be generating and creating more growth on its own. So you get those very, very polarizing views on these questions. But nevertheless, we know stimulus is part of the dialogue. It occurs, it's going on. And oftentimes it's forgotten that President Bush actually, in February of 2008, actually enacted his own stimulus package. It was about $165 billion, much smaller than Obama's, where actually the government sent out small $400 or $500 rebate checks in 2008. But it didn't seem to have much of an impact measured up against the degree of the financial crisis, which of course was unparalleled since the 1930s. Okay, so chapter 24 is really just walking us through a discussion. Just like before, we looked at how changes in investment could influence output income. Now we're simply talking about changes in government spending. And what we're talking about now is we have an equation, y equals c plus I. Now we add into it g. And if you add government stimulus or spending into this, g, then we just simply add that onto our equation. Again, solve out for y, and we get our new aggregate output, aggregate income equilibrium points. The easy thing about G, changes in government spending G, it has the equivalent change as what we looked at before with investment. So when we talked about the multiplier or the investment multiplier, now we can simply just call that the government spending multiplier when the government in fact changes spending to try to help create growth and foster job creation. So the government spending multiplier is just the same, 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC. That's pretty straightforward. If the government wants to create growth and create jobs, they can either spend more money or cut taxes. If they want to pull back on the economy, and this would typically be in inflationary periods, then the government has the tools to cut government spending or raise taxes. A lot's going on in our political discourse about should we extend the Bush tax cuts. And again, there's lots of things surrounding that, that are very much debatable and good questions. But just in a general sense, growing the economy means spending more. Cutting taxes, of course, the inevitable result from this type of expansionary policy, with more spending, less taxes, is it results in government budget deficits and increases the national debt. Does the public seem to accept those terms? Who knows? In terms of taxes, though, notice taxes is not in our equation, y equals c plus I plus g. So if we're going to use taxes as a tool, for example, we'll say lower taxes causes an increase now in disposable income. Well, now that disposable income is going to lead to an increase in consumption, and then we'll go right back through the multiplier effect. Same multiplier effect we had with the government spending and investment multiplier. But now, since we begin to cut in taxes outside the initial model, T's not in our equation, C plus I plus G, the tax multiplier is going to be slightly different than the government spending multiplier. Turns out the tax multiplier is going to be equivalent to negative MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. Another way of thinking about it, perhaps an easier way to think about it, is that the tax multiplier is always going to be 1 minus the spending multiplier. So in the example we did before with investment, we found that the multiplier for our equation with the MPC of 0.75 is 4. So if you have a multiplier, investment or government spending multiplier of 4, then that means your tax multiplier is going to be negative 3. The negative is because it takes lowering taxes, negative taxes in a sense, to produce a positive outcome. The investment and spending multiplier is positive because it takes more investment or more spending to produce that positive outcome. Okay, so we have, and you can go through chapter 24 and see the development there of the government spending multiplier as well as the tax multiplier. There's also something called a balanced budget multiplier. If we are really concerned about a balanced budget, which one could argue politically the country is really not, you can get a balanced budget multiplier by taking the spending multiplier plus the tax multiplier. And in our example, we've worked through, spending multiplier is 4 plus tax multiplier negative 3. That gives us a balanced budget multiplier of 1, which is always going to be the case, no matter what consumption function you begin with, no matter what the value of the marginal propensity to consume, you're always going to end up with a balanced budget multiplier of 1, which would say to us, if we want to grow an economy by a specific amount, but we want to maintain a balanced budget, and we know that enacting purely expansionary policies, raising spending and or cutting taxes creates deficits, how can we get there with a balanced budget? Well, we use that balanced budget multiplier, which is 1, which says for whatever amount we need to change or move the economy in terms of, say, GDP, we need to change both government spending and taxes by that same amount. So if we want to increase GDP by 100 billion, what we would need to do then is increase government spending by 100 billion, increase taxes by an equal 100 billion, and then the net fallout from those two things, one expansionary, one contractionary, since the government spending multiplier is going to be more powerful, would be an offsetting $100 billion increase in GDP. Interesting reading also, if you walk through that, about the balanced budget multiplier on page 480. In terms of the federal budget, we know currently the federal budget is in the ballpark of about 3.8 or so trillion is about how much money the federal government actually spends. Turns out that we only take in somewhere in the ballpark of about, for this fiscal year, about $2.3 trillion. So the remaining difference there, which is about 1.5 trillion, represents, for this fiscal year, our annual or yearly budget deficit, which is, by historical standards, extremely high. It's just slightly over about 10-11% of total GDP. Again, much of this was brought on by, of course, the financial collapse and the Great Recession that began way back in December of 2007. So much of this is related to the recession steps that had to be taken, at least felt they had to be taken by both President Bush, his administration, and President Obama, his administration, in order to stabilize the economy. So, once you factor all those things in, the question that sometimes is forgotten to be asked: what would have happened without the massive government infusion of dollars, both from the federal government and the Federal Reserve, since the financial crisis and Great Recession occurred? Where could we potentially be at? And I think there tends to be, I won't say a complete agreement, but perhaps a majority agree that we would be in some version of a Great Depression 2.0. Of course, it's difficult to know, but that tends to be the general thinking, and tends to generally be my view of where we possibly would be without those extraordinary steps that were taken on multiple levels. Again, as I said, if you were okay with chapter 23, chapter 24 is just an extension. We added another term, G, government spending, and T, taxes, tax multiplier, government spending multiplier. Just a quick word on the national debt. The national debt is something that you hear a lot about in the news. The total accumulation over time of budget deficits that never get repaid. Currently, the national debt is somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 trillion. Now, again, that's going to be total, what's called national or public debt. Actually, the private sector only holds somewhere around 7 or 8 trillion of that. The remainder is actually held by the federal government itself. So you see different accounts of what the amounts of the national debt are. If you go by that figure 12 trillion, and we roughly have an economy around 13.5, 14 trillion, we're nearing, for total debt, around 100%. If you go back to the 8 figure, we're still, 60, 70%, somewhere in that ballpark. I'm not merely such a pessimist on the negative influence of government debt, in so much as, where would we be without it? What could potentially happen without the government spending in the last few years? And in fact, the national debt has been an accumulation of debt over time. This is not something that just occurred. In 1980, though, if you want to go back just a little bit of history, the national debt was still under $1 trillion. About $900 billion was the national debt. By 1988, the national debt jumps to about $4 trillion. By 1992, it jumps to about $7 trillion. And then by year 2000, we're back down about 5.5, 6 trillion, 5 trillion, somewhere in that ballpark. And then by 2008, we're about 10 trillion in terms of the national debt. And then, as I said today, we're somewhere in the ballpark of 12 trillion. What is a national debt? It's simply the government issuing savings bonds, treasury bills, notes, and bonds to the public at large, and the public buy these up. If you own a savings bond, you own a piece of the national debt. Again, it's a deep and complex subject. I'm just not so sure that it's the fait accompli, the end of the world, that some, especially political commentators, may make it out to be. Could it potentially be? Absolutely. Again, in my opinion, are we there now? Probably not. And in fact, many are advocating that we don't really worry too much about the debt now, today, until we get the economy growing again and jobs created. Okay. Also, if you want to look at a couple good problems, number 2 on page 489 is a good one. Number 7 is a good problem. And in the appendix, appendix B, which is on page 492, number 1 at the bottom is a really good problem to look at. Hopefully you're working through these chapter homeworks and quizzes. This gets us through chapter 24. This is where the exam will stop at. So we'll have an exam over 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24. And it's scheduled to be posted on September the 24th, which is 2 weeks from today. So hopefully you're caught up through chapter 22, and you use these final 2 weeks to work through chapters 23 and 24. Don't hesitate to contact me. And if you have difficulties with the material, don't think that you're the only one. These are very difficult chapters, and oftentimes can be very trying. But just hang in there. Email me or let me know if you're having trouble. Try to work some of the problems, and try to read through the material and give it a good thought process. Think through it. Try to understand it. Read it, reread it, and I'm sure you'll be fine. All right, let me know if you have any problems, and if not, take care. And since this is a Friday for me, have a good weekend.